Good evening, everyone. If I can ask everyone to take their seats. And a huge welcome to this very, very, very special Literature Live evening. A huge thank you to the Trident for feeding us as though there was no tomorrow and having us here in this incredible room with the incredible bay right outside us. So a huge thank you to them. As some of you know, Literature Live was started by a gentleman called Anil Dharkar. It was he went a bit Don Quixote in the sense that he had this vision and this idea of a space where ideas could be talked about and a place where ideas could be discussed. And that was Literature Live. Fortunately, he found quite a few Sanchos. A lot of them are in the room, members who keep that dream alive. And more importantly, he found support. And support from the city and from the citizens of this city who felt that his dream was worth nurturing. And I thank so many of you here who've helped keep that dream alive. Today is what we call a Literature Live evening. Normally, it is usually connected to a book. But if we were to wait for Dr. Tharoor to write the book on this topic, it would probably be next week. But we are all aware that the world is becoming a strange place. To use another literary reference, almost Kafkaesque. There are conflicts that are active across the world, and the world community seems to stand by. There are strange things happening with AI, which most of us nod and are not quite sure what is happening. And of course, there's a man in an ivory-colored building that seems to be as unpredictable as the Mumbai monsoon. But as we enter August, it's a good time to reflect on where India stands. And that's why we invited Dr. Tharoor to give us a little perspective on where our country stands in this new global order. As some of you might be aware, he has been on a whirlwind tour representing India around the world, and at the moment is on a whirlwind tour of our city. To quote a line from the stage musical Hamilton, "The man is non-stop." So it gives me great pleasure to welcome former diplomat, author, parliamentarian, and someone who we still proudly call a Mumbaikar, Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you, Kwasar, for that wonderful introduction, and good to see you all here. It's always good to be back at Literature Live, not least because I've been involved with it since its inception, since Anil Dharkar first had this idea, invited me to speak, and has thereafter, of course, not just had me come to the annual event, but also had a number of standalone occasions like this. Sadly, he's not with us, but it's a tribute to his extraordinary contributions to this city and to the world of ideas that I allowed myself to be press-ganged into giving you this talk. Now, Kwasar, I have bad news for you. You don't have to wait till next week for the book. I've already written it. It's called The New World Disorder and the Indian Imperative. It's to its great misfortune, it was published just as COVID was breaking out. So it more or less sank without trace. It was also a co-authored book with my good friend Samir Saran, the president of the Observer Research Foundation. It has some sort of shelf life in libraries, but it's around. I gave it the title, The New World Disorder. Samir added, and the Indian Imperative. So it covers the ground. But unfortunately for me, in terms of preparing today's lecture, the world has changed a lot since we wrote that book. That was 5 years ago. But I will, I think, try and cover some basic ground in the talk. Then Anuradha SenGupta is going to be in dialogue with me, and then you're going to be in dialogue with me. So we'll try and see if we can deal with the main issues from whichever perspective you're interested in. There's no time that like the present, but the present is, I'm afraid, a world convulsed by war, challenged by increasing fragmentation, and confronted by the erosion of the shared principles that had sustained the world order. So the certainties of yesterday are giving way to uncertainties today, one of which was I thought I had turned off the sound on my phone. But I had to keep it near me because Yashasvi Jaiswal is nearing his century It wasn't on. So once in a while, if you see me taking a furtive look at the phone, it's not because anyone's giving me tips as to what to say to you. It's because Jaiswal is 97 not out. And I'm fingers crossed, okay? Right. So that's one of the uncertainties, but I hope it'll be fine. On the coattails, as Kwasar mentioned, of the resounding success of Operation Sindoor, India has once again found itself the center of global attention. We'd been a sort of diplomatic dark horse for some time, but in many ways, the multi-party delegations made a point and did so rather interestingly. I mean, even the composition of our delegations represented the kind of image India was starting anew to project. My team, for example, had 8 people representing 8 different states, 5 political parties, and 3 religions. And that's what India is, that's what it's all about, and that's the message we try to convey with that. But I'm not here really to talk about that. I mentioned it only because Kwasar did. If you want to ask questions about that, I'll address it in the Q&A. I'm more struck by the fact that we inhabit a world so fluid that it's very difficult for any nation, not just India, to entirely pinpoint where we stand in the shifting geopolitical order. And in some ways, we're good with ambiguity. There's something about the Indian mind that deals rather well with ambiguities. And at a time when all the old verities are being stretched thin and new fault lines are emerging, India occupies a rare strategic space. In some ways, it's a fulcrum between East and West and between North and South. And in a world that's increasingly defined by polarization, we have a potential role to play as a balancing force, urging dialogue, keeping open communications or lines of contact with both sides in every one of the world's major conflicts, and at the same time forging partnerships that in many ways seek to transcend the business and the binaries of zero-sum geopolitics. So let me just briefly take you back to where all this began, since the topic I've been given is about the New World Order. Let me say that the broad superstructure of what was called the liberal international order was the order that was established at the end of the Second World War, when the victors of that time essentially imposed their rules upon the rest of the world. The UN was the carapace under which this order was supposed to run. And in many ways, lots of good things happened under it. Certainly, we avoided World War III, which is not a bad thing, considering what World War I and II were like. And we were able not just to secure a certain degree of global peace. I mean, the world was not completely at peace, but a lot of the conflicts were outsourced to the likes of us, outsourced to the margins, as it were, whereas the central global system divided between these two superpowers remained nonetheless at peace. There is no question, of course, that global coexistence and cooperation rested on some common sets of principles and values, the sovereignty of states above all, but also the need to avoid, for example, the use of force in settling international disputes, treating borders as sacrosanct, and finding common ground on a whole host of issues that my late boss Kofi Annan used to call problems without passports, problems that transcended all borders, that crossed essentially the planet. So everything from the environment and the need to sustain it, to human rights issues, to urban living and the whole phenomenon of urbanization taking place. Conversely, the challenges of desertification, the challenges of global warming, all of these things which required countries to cooperate because no one country could fence off its climate or fence off its rights or fence off its own interests in these areas. Those became the common ground for the liberal international order. And at the same time, this could not mask the cold reality of a superpower confrontation underneath. In that period that I'm talking about, there were essentially two superpowers. If you look at the world from 45 to about 1990, it was a world divided in this binary between the United States and the Soviet Union, and only they, too, possess a structural heft to shape the international order, the geopolitical order. This, of course, unfolded or unraveled, I should say, with the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and suddenly the era of bipolarity was succeeded by what was called for a while the unipolar moment, where the only power, the only superpower that mattered in the world was the United States. So if you want me to put a date on it, say roughly 1990 to about 2010. During this time, the Soviet Union was, of course, it disappeared essentially and became 15 countries. And the survivor state, the successor state of Russia, wasn't a shadow of what the USSR had been. It still had nuclear powers, it still had a permanent seat of the UN, but now was rising quietly, unobtrusively, and with the cooperation of the existing superpower, there was rising China. And I must say the period that I'm describing to you, those 20 years or so, the US was not just unrivaled in terms of power, but it dominated global affairs politically, militarily, economically, and technologically. But today, or let's say from about 2010, the US no longer remains uncontested in any of those four categories. So you have the financial crisis of 2002, 2008-9, collapse of Lehman Brothers, all of that stuff. And suddenly people looked around and found that, in fact, one country was doing better than the rest, and that was China. The peaceful rise of the last quarter, of the previous quarter of the century, fueled by American investment in its industries and, of course, its own burgeoning export economy with a vast market in America and so on, had culminated in its supplanting the US as a global manufacturing and industrial powerhouse, rivaling it in economic scale, surpassing its trade surpluses, and beginning to challenge it even in cutting-edge technologies. Now, that era of the Cold War, as I said, replaced by a unipolar moment, and now by something one might call a cold coexistence. COVID-19, which we all remember now as a bad memory, marked the end of also a kind of glowing period for multilateralism and ushered in what many feared would be an era of deglobalization, where the world seemingly embracing isolationism and protectionism far more than ever before. There was a rush, for example, to reset global supply chains and raise trade barriers. The demand arose for more protectionism and more Atmanirbharta in our country, more self-reliance everywhere. Everyone wanted to bring manufacturing and production value chains back home, or at least closer to home. You had nearshoring in the American parlance and friendshoring as well. With this shift came a broader break from the rules-based global order we'd all taken for granted, which had prized mutual interdependence, multilateral relations, and a commitment to improving overall the human condition as being in everybody's interest. Suddenly, COVID taught everybody it was their own interest that mattered first, more than anyone else's. And then we ended up with another increasingly bipolar world. It's not quite there yet. There are many, many differences between the peak of the Cold War and the era today. Yes, China has become a rival, one can use the word superpower, but unlike, for example, the old Cold War, the Russians and the Russians and the Americans had no contact worth the name during the old Cold War. The Americans and the Chinese have extensive contacts, trade relations, hundreds of billions of dollars of trade relations. The Chinese own vast amounts of American treasury securities. There are American scholars crawling all over China. There are Chinese scholars in American campuses. It's very different from the Cold War. So we can't really think of it as a repeat of history, but there is now an ongoing tussle between the multilateralism we celebrated till COVID, and a sort of renewed transactional bipolarity, where everything depends on what the Americans and the Chinese will do to each other or with each other. And this is happening at a time when the rest of the world is also rising. So the rise of the rest is also happening. And very often, in fact, the rest includes countries like us, the so-called emerging market economies, who wanted to assure the West it's not the decline of the West, it's the rise of the rest. And therefore, we can all rise together, which doesn't always entirely work. Now, from climate financing to digital infrastructure, global public goods, the developing world now suddenly realized it could find its own space and the capability to make its voice heard. So the Global South suddenly became a term of art. And the prowess of the Global South in innovation, in sustainability, and in entrepreneurship, combined with a significant demographic advantage that it holds, because the South is much more youthful than the aging North. All this gives countries the leverage to be non-West without needing to be anti-West. And they're carving out their own space in the process. India is a very significant player in this process. Now, century ho gaya. Thank you very much. Well, now I don't need to look, but that is very good news. I see him 104. Excellent. Well, now long may he thrive and continue. Now, having played a foundational role in shaping the non-aligned movement under Pandit Nehru, India has, in recent years, sort of reimagined its policy under what I'm proud to say I first dubbed multi-alignment. If you're looking for it in one of my books, it's in my book Pax Indica, published in 2012. I was using the term in speeches for a few years before that. I must say, to a very cold reception from the Indian foreign policy establishment. We thought it was sacrilege to speak about it. So there's a certain particular satisfaction I get that the current foreign minister uses the term as if he was born to it. But the fact is that what I'm talking about is maintaining a series of relationships in different configurations, some overlapping, some not, with a variety of countries for different purposes. So to give you an example, I mean, every year our foreign minister meets with his Russian and Chinese counterparts in something called RIC. Then we add the Brazilians and the South Africans in something called BRICS. Now, of course, BRICS is 11, but let me talk about the original one. Then we subtract the Russians, but we keep the Chinese in something called BASIC for environmental negotiations. And then we knock the Chinese out too, and we have IBSA for South-South cooperation with Brazil and South Africa. And India is the only one in all these configurations, and not merely because our name conveniently begins with that indispensable acronym, an element in any acronym, a vowel, but because actually these institutions all matter to us. We have contributions to make to them, and they are useful to us as well. And that's the kind of multi-alignment I was talking about, which goes along with the World Wide Web kind of world we're in, where networks are in every direction. And just as I may be connected to you on the internet and you may be connected to him, but I may not be connected to him, similarly, we can have these relationships that cut across various lines. We're not confined to the binary of the Cold War or to just one set of relationships. Now, that's basically the key change. It's one that involves active engagement and strategic balancing. It does give us an opportunity to be a more assertive India sometimes. We're not just seeking to exist between competing powers, as non-alignment helped us to do, but to shape the space between these competing powers. We are navigating an increasingly networked world with agility and clarity, and we're forging coalitions that advance both national interests and universal principles. Now, I'd like to say that this kind of relationship, or set of relationships that India has been going, have given it a very influential role in global geopolitics. And of course, one of the areas where in particular we saw a significant uptick under the then benign inspiration of the US was in the so-called Indo-Pacific. A term about, because it always used to be called the Asia-Pacific by Washington. They started calling it the Indo-Pacific precisely because they wanted to give us more importance in it. And we find that the pivot to Asia strategy that successive American presidents announced actually turned India into a significant player, putting us, for example, into the Quad. And don't forget that the Indo-Pacific isn't just a PR label. It's home to nearly 60% of the world's population. It has over 2/3 of its megacities and about 30% of global arms spending as well. So for us, the Quad actually, guided as it is by a vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific, represents a sort of strategic choice we'd made and a cooperative set of relations with a bunch of partners. We don't call anybody allies yet because we don't have any treaty alliances with anyone, but we call them partners. And this is an important strategic partnership for us, in which India is not a peripheral participant, but a key pillar, even of the security architecture. That's a debatable thing, and we can talk about that some more if you want. But we'll be hosting the Quad Summit later this year, and all eyes are now on the rather unpredictable Mr. Trump to see whether he will continue to give the Quad the importance that he himself did in his first term and that other American presidents have done in recent decades. The other thing that I want to mention, of course, is India's presence. We used to be known, as it were, for heading or being a major voice of the global trade union of developing countries, the so-called G77. Now we're a major voice of the global management system, the G20. And we, as you know, hosted the G20 a couple of years ago with great fanfare and much public attention, while at the same time seeking to serve as a voice of the global South, which is kind of developing country 2.0 notion that the global South is much more than just a bunch of developing countries. It's an entire attitude to the world, to a transforming world in which we are players with our own active voice and whose center of gravity itself is changing. Look at BRICS. I mentioned how we've gone from 5 now to 11 members. We've got a wide variety of new members in it, and with countries like Egypt, Ethiopia, the Emirates, Iran coming in, suddenly BRICS has acquired a pan-planetary dimension, which clearly some people in Washington have decided to take a good hard look at and apparently don't like, judging by Mr. Trump's comments about it. And we'll have to see. In some ways, yes, it's fair to say that some in the BRICS would have liked to see it as an alternative to resist a global hegemony on the part of powerful Western countries. But on the other hand, while India is about to assume the presidency of BRICS next year, there is a moment of both momentum and concern with, as you know, Mr. Trump threatening extra tariffs on any members of BRICS. We've already had one dose of tariffs a couple of days ago. He hasn't yet announced any additional tariffs on BRICS, but that's something we'll have to think about. And at the same time, we have some heft of our own because the collective BRICS economy actually stands at a larger GDP number than that of the G7, which used to be the 7 largest economies in the world and no longer is. So all of this gives you a picture of the somewhat confused world order that we are now confronting. As I said, when I wrote my book about the new world disorder, I was talking about other things. Pretty much everything I've summarized for you now has evolved literally in the last few years. Economically, we've continued to grow. We are the 4th largest economy in dollar terms. We're already the 3rd largest economy in PPP, purchasing power parity terms, and we will be the 3rd largest in dollar terms as well by 2030, some say 2028. And that's because we have our projected growth now of 6.4%. And even though that's less than many would have liked, if we sustain that, we'll end up overtaking Japan even in dollar terms. We have, of course, a vast and skilled workforce. Skilled, I'm exaggerating a bit. I think a lot of the workforce is not adequately skilled to take advantage of the opportunities available in the 21st century. But we're now developing some of that slowly, too slowly for my taste, but it's happening. We've got new, deepening industrial corridors. And of course, we have this web of diplomatic and trade linkages, which is being augmented by newly signed trade agreements. The Indo-UK agreement has just been signed, comprehensive economic and trade agreement. We are talking to the Europeans about another agreement. And Japan might be coming down the pike for us. And suddenly, we're looking at seeing significant increases in trade with all these potential partners. Imagine 99% of our exports, for example, can now enter the UK duty-free. And everybody here with any business idea in mind should start selling to the Brits. Not to mention the fact that Scotch whisky is going to get a lot cheaper. And as the evening wears on, I'm sure we'll all turn our thoughts to that particular British product. Now, in many ways, when you talk about India in this particular context, there are other aspects of India's emergence that are worth mentioning. There's technological sophistication, which is something the world is really sitting up and taking seriously, from indigenously developed anti-drone systems and air defense capabilities to precision-guided munitions and supersonic BrahMos, which already made a tremendous impact in the 88-hour war with Pakistan. We have cutting-edge capabilities which are getting better by the day. We are also accompanying that kind of technology on the military side with a new approach and a new doctrine, shifting from reaction and restraint to intelligent, scalable deterrence. And to signal to the world, we're not going to turn the other cheek if terrorists come across and kill our civilians. We will respond in a precise, calibrated, but highly effective manner. And all of this is certainly going to be of some value. I know many of you will want to ask more about that, and I'll save that for the Q&A. But I will say that we've had a couple of good developments after Operation Sindhu that are worth pointing to. The US declaration of the Resistance Front, the so-called the Lashkar-e-Toiba's proxy group that claimed credit for the Pahalgam massacre on the 22nd of April. And they claimed credit within 45 minutes, which makes it authentic because no one had reported the news by then when they claimed credit for it. That was a very good development that the US has now condemned it, whereas China had succeeded in getting the Security Council not to mention the Resistance Front in their statement condemning Pahalgam. Now the US has collected enough evidence and decided that they know this is a terrorist group and they've condemned it. And a different note, when the Colombian government, which I visited, had issued a statement at the time of Operation Sindoor expressing, quote unquote, heartfelt condolences to the civilian victims in Pakistan, unquote. After we went and talked to them, they withdrew that statement and issued one of great sympathy and understanding for India. So there is a global interest there, but it's not just in defense. I want to talk also about our extraordinary digital economy. Officially, we have over 800 million people using the internet. The real figure might be even closer to 1 billion. Our technological momentum is just amazing. I don't know how many of you saw that video by a Pakistani visitor on WhatsApp that expressed astonishment at the fact that chaiwalas now had QR codes that people could actually use their mobile phones to scan with. That's now a part of India's image just as much as snake charmers and fakirs lying on beds of nails used to be. And what else is happening? We have Aadhaar, which has been universally admired. We have UPI. UPI is the United Payments Interface that is completely indigenously developed, and that is actually swifter than SWIFT, the American-invented state-of-the-art technology for transferring payments from bank to bank. Suddenly, UPI is better, faster, swifter, and people are sitting up. QR code and two taps, and you have your money gone. And it's become global. 19 countries have signed up for it already, and Namibia being the most recent. And I suspect before too long, it will be the payment method of choice across much of the global south. And the global north will probably have to sit up and say, hey, why don't we get in on this too? So there's going to be a lot of things happening. I'd like to see more initiatives on the AI race, but all the right things are being attempted to begin with. We have already 16 to 20% of the world's AI professionals. And then if you look at the Silicon Valley AI crowd, about 40% of those are actually Indians, expatriate Indians working in Silicon Valley developing AI. So Indian brains are very, very much at work here. And I would like to think that we can continue doing well in that field. We are already, by the way, the top country of origin for foreign-born billionaires in the US. The number doubled from 5 such in 2022 to 12 in 2025. And of course, more significantly for us, since those guys are there, and paying taxes there and not here, or evading taxes there and not here. Let me say that what's striking about our digital economy today is that it's now generating nearly 1/5 of India's GDP, which is something most people don't realize. It's truly transformative. I mean, I don't know. I've got my good friend Nadir Godrej sitting here, who may have a different view about traditional industries, but I do think that there are some significant challenges now to the sort of bricks and mortar, solid, visible, tangible projects and products kind of businesses from the transformation and the valuation of the digital transformation that's taking place. And, you know, there's the technology, not just in military, not just in bank transactions and UPI and mobile phone payments, even in things like vaccines. India has made a mark. We were able to give vaccines to over 100 developing countries during COVID-19 at a time when many of the rich countries are far too busy stashing up and stocking up vaccines for their own population, most of which they ended up throwing away after the pandemic was over, and which could have actually saved lives in Africa and elsewhere. India might never have actually been able to help as many people as the West could have, but the fact that we did what we did and we got some help out there is something that is noticed and appreciated by a number of developing countries. And then there's a traditional Indian engagement with the UN. We've given almost 3,290,000 peacekeepers in over 50 UN missions around the world. Even today, we're the fourth largest troop contributing nation, but cumulatively, we have been by far the first. Today, we have only about 5,000 peacekeepers in 9 of the UN's 11 operations. A couple of countries are larger in terms of numbers, but our credibility is very much higher. So we are, in other words, a player in across all of these different sectors I've mentioned, and in the resolution of both peace crises or conflict crises and healthcare crises. And at the same time, we must acknowledge there are many, many challenges in the road ahead, social, economic, and geopolitical, that we have to confront with both clarity and purpose. And for India to not just rise, but to lead in the new world order, we have to address some of these with unity, with foresight, and with resolve. I'm not going to get into great length on the subject of the quest for a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. If any of you are still really interested, I'll be very happy to address it in great detail. But what worries me now, apart from the fact that this has been dragging on for 3.5 decades and shows no sign of resolution, is the bigger concern that the institution of the UN itself is being increasingly questioned for its effectiveness or lack thereof in some of the major conflicts facing the world today. After all, when a permanent member of the Security Council, whether it was the US in Iraq in 2003 or the Russia and Ukraine in 2022, essentially disregards the UN Charter that it is pledged to uphold, violates the sovereignty of a member state by disregarding the rest of the UN Security Council, and just goes ahead and acts, then you ask, well, what exactly is the UN worth? It's there to prevent this kind of thing happening, and yet its own custodians are doing that. And that's something else that we could possibly talk about, because if the UN is reduced to a series of hollow declarations and ineffective resolutions, while suffering on the ground, whether in Ukraine or Gaza or anywhere else, continues unabated, then those questions are indeed reasonable to ask. Now, I'm not somebody who urges us to give up on multilateralism. I've spent too much of my life defending and advancing it myself, but I do believe more and more that for us to be able to take advantage of multilateralism, we have to be incredibly capable of protecting ourselves, strengthening our own capacities, building coalitions of consequence, investing in regional and plurilateral groupings as well, as we've been doing with Quad and BRICS and all of these other acronyms I tossed at you, and enhancing our own economic and military self-reliance. So, yes, we have to be prepared to lead in our own areas where it directly affects us, even when global institutions falter and where others merely pronounce. Now, at the same time, we have some challenges. For example, of all the Quad members and all the BRICS members, we're the only ones who actually face a direct military threat across our own borders from China. So we can't be deterred from safeguarding our sovereignty by restoring, by talking about restoring world institutions and peace if those provide a cover for an unfriendly neighbor to gradually nibble away at our own territory. So we have to have the capacity to engage economically with a country like China, where we must, but at the same time bolster our military deterrence so they're not tempted into any irresponsible adventures, and defend our geopolitical and economic interests on our own terms. Now, we also have to seriously look at our own trade dependencies. After Mr. Trump's Liberation Day tariff strategy, which has imposed 25% on us, as opposed to 19 on Pakistan, as opposed to 20 on many of our competitors, Vietnam, Indonesia, and others. And on top of that, there's going to be apparently an unspecified penalty because we're buying Russian oil and gas. That threatens about $90 billion in Indian exports, and according to some experts, could shave 0.5% off our GDP. So that's not a small matter. And for us, therefore, we need to negotiate skillfully to find a way forward without compromising any of our core national interests. We have to show adequate flexibility and adequate common sense to know what's worth defending and what we can afford to give in on in order to get some of this onerous burden lifted. Now, there's no doubt in my own mind that our diaspora has been an asset for us, but we have to still ask ourselves, are we going to continue to rely on them completely in countries like the US and so on, or are we going to try and keep them at home or attract them to come back because we need their talent, their abilities, their experience, and their money back in India? It's a tough question to answer. As one who lived and worked abroad myself, I would not discourage or deny anyone the right to do that, but I do hope that we'll be able to get the benefit of all of those qualities that I just mentioned if we can make our own conditions at home attractive enough for them to be able to work for us and serve us here. I think I've covered pretty much most of the key issues I'd like to cover. I have far too many pages of notes for the time available. But what I'd like to do is, of course, engage in further discussion with Anuradha and then with you on some of these in more detail. But let me stress, we are not at all keen on seeing another Cold War. We're not at all keen either on seeing a condominium of the two of them, the sort of so-called G2 idea that was floated 10 years ago, where the two of them would get along lovey-dovey and then boss the rest of us. We don't want that either. What we want, of course, is a multipolar world, one in which each has its own space. And that's why about a week ago I wrote an op-ed in The Hindu, for example, advocating very strongly that we start cultivating Europe as we haven't really done before. Because Europe is emerging as a new pole in its own right. And that we start diversifying our partnerships, our trade agreements, and increasing the space we need ourselves to deal with these global contradictions I've tried to describe to you. Pragmatic partnerships are what we will need to do in this turbulent and uncertain world order. One final thought, of course, relates to the structures of global governance. As somebody who spent nearly 3 decades at the United Nations extolling the virtues of globalization and multilateralism and their unifying power, I'm sorry to say that I find myself much less certain of their prospects today. In this increasingly volatile world, nations have been largely left to fend for themselves, navigate crises on their own, while the machinery of global governance has often been found wanting. So I think it's important that we see what role we can play in leveraging our influence to get these new big superpowers to cooperate on everything from future pandemics to environmental disasters, on all these other problems with our passports I talked about, on the grounds that global cooperation is better for all of us than intensified rivalry would be. And I think very clearly these are not amenable to being treated with a unilateral brush. Subjects like terrorism, migration, climate change, cybersecurity, and even the rise of AI require more international cooperation, not less. So that's pretty much where I think I would like to leave it, in this increasingly fluid global order, marked by the relative decline of rigid bipolarity of the past, but the rise of a new kind of bipolarity potentially. Let's look at ourselves as uniquely positioned, with rising economic weight, with a conviction of the importance of our own strategic autonomy, with some credibility across geopolitical divides. We're the only country, for example, with ambassadors in both Tel Aviv and Ramallah, with a prime minister who can hug Mr. Putin in Moscow and 1 week later hug Mr. Zelensky in Kyiv. So there are some signs that we can play a useful role within the shifting contours of the new world order. I will say, though, that there is no doubt that harnessing this new environment to tackle not just the great global challenges of our times, but the challenges we face in growing, in developing, in pulling our own people out of poverty, and in finding our place in the sun in the 21st century, we will have to find a new way forward from the ones we've tried in the past. Leveraging influence, fostering cooperation, bridging divides, and shaping, to the extent we can, even the rules of engagement for others. This is not a moment for retreat. It's a moment for strategic ambition. It's a moment, at the same time, one guided by principle and conviction, not just by opportunism. And we must, of course, always keep our own national interests, which is the interest of all Indians, paramount in the way in which we conduct this role. Nehruji famously asked the question to all of us, who lives if India dies? Who dies if India lives? A united India in this environment is not just a political slogan, it's a prerequisite for us and for global leadership. When we are united, we are far more than the sum of our parts. We're not just capable of responding to the world, we can be ready to shape it. So let's hope that things go in the way that we are capable of making them go. Thank you for listening to me so patiently, and Jai Hind.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tharoor. That's a lot to unpack. And to help us unpack, can we please invite Anuradha SenGupta, journalist and also dear friend of Literature Live.
Thank you, Quasar. Thank you, Dr. Tharoor, for giving us the historical context. As to, you brought us up to here.
Thank you. Yes, I have.
It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here to do this conversation with Dr. Tharoor. He's not only, as you know, one of our most erudite and articulate political leaders.
Thank you.
And authors, but he's also, and especially in the past few months, you've become the face of Indian diplomacy. Almost, if I were to put it, like India's ambassador to the world.
You're far too generous and far too kind, but I'm happy to accept.
You know what I mean, right?
I get enough hate mail most of the time, so it's nice to have some love coming my way. Many thanks.
Let's talk about multilateralism, because you ended with that note. And we've seen how the rules-based order has eroded. You've spent, like you said, 30 years at the UN, worked with...
29, actually, but nonetheless, stretches.
Worked with Kofi Annan, up to 2006, when you lost out on that Secretary General election to Ban Ki-moon. The question I have to you is, how in this world that you've described so lucidly in the past half an hour, how do you make a case for multilateralism? Because what has happened is that all those greater good of humanity, whether it's climate change, global south, health, the SDGs, all of those have gone out of the window, it feels. How do you make a case?
They haven't gone out the windows because what we do to replace them? I mean, the problem is these are real problems.
Yeah.
I mean, the environment does affect everybody, right? So these problems with our passports, to use Kofi's phrase again, require blueprints without borders. You have to be able to transcend national divisions to be able to find solutions. Otherwise, it doesn't work. No country can solve the environment on its own, right? So if you can't promote cooperation, it doesn't work. Even the agenda-setting function of the UN, in just actually agreeing on the main principles, the main diagnosis of some of these problems, can be invaluable. Now, I'm not suggesting that they've done a superb job. I mean, now, I think India is going to be hosting COP33 or is it COP38 in a few years' time. But by then, God knows how much has changed in the climate that we haven't been able to arrest. Global warming has already exceeded the dire projections and predictions of
So
a few years ago.
how do you make a case for a strong
Because-
UN, given the Security Council and how it works, and given that we are seeing all these conflicts break out? How do you make a case
Well, the
for
best-
something you believe in so strongly?
The best answer to your question was actually given by a former Soviet ambassador to the UN many, many decades ago, a man called Yakov Malik, who said famously, whenever people ask me, what's the use of the UN? So, what good does it do? Whatever. He says, I'm reminded of a story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where Adam finds that Eve is becoming a bit indifferent to him. So Adam says to Eve, Eve, is there someone else? And that's the real question about the UN. Is there anything else? Is there any alternative? I mean, this is what you've got. And honestly, I doubt we'd be able to create it today if it didn't exist. We've got to try and make it work. There is no alternative to it. And honestly, that's what it comes down to. Is there anything else? There isn't. Is there any other common platform where all the countries of the world can come together and actually deal with the kinds of issues we've been talking about? There isn't. And that's the case. It may not be the best enough case. But then again, to give you an old quote, Dag Hammarskjöld famously said that the United Nations was not created to take mankind to heaven, but rather to save humanity from hell. Sometimes the best it can do is not the best that you want it to do, but to prevent things from getting any worse.
But it
And at least that it can do.
In terms of conflicts, it hasn't managed to do that, isn't it?
In some conflicts it has. You see, whenever the superpowers don't have a stake, then conflicts can be resolved. There are conflicts resolved in many parts of Africa, conflicts resolved in many corners of the world, the Middle East, even at one time. For example, the war in Lebanon was brought to an end with UN peacekeepers being deployed. You also had the earlier iterations. I mean, Middle East has seen so many different conflicts now, West Asia, but nonetheless, many were indeed resolved by the UN. Then you've seen, the UN bringing solutions to everything from Haiti to Georgia, lots of places where it was in the interest of the big powers to let the smaller and middle powers under the UN's blue flag come in and police the peace. And this is why the UN won. The UN Blue Helmets have won the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, twice. So I would say that things have worked. But when the big powers, whether it was the Soviet Union and the US in those days, who fortunately didn't get into a hot war, or today it so happens that the two involved are the US and Russia, then I'm afraid if they are directly engaged in basically tossing the charter aside and marching in pursuit of their interests, then there's nothing much that the rest of the world can do except try and temper it, try and contain it, try and alleviate the consequences for the people on the ground and hope like heck that they would stop sooner rather than later. Now, both these conflicts, Ukraine and Gaza, are showing no signs of stopping. But that's the worry that if they don't, that we all have, it seems to me, an enormous sort of frustration, thank you so much, frustration about whether the world order is working for the rest of the world. I mean, the horror stories coming out of Gaza day after day makes people feel despair for humanity. And at one time that was also true of what was coming out of Ukraine. And yet it goes on.
And we are watching all of this streamed real time. But Dr. Tharoor, let me ask you about, you brought up Gaza and Russia. Let's talk about, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Let's look at how India's relations, and you talked about national interest, we've talked about this in the past, India's national interest in both these contexts. So, for instance, Russian oil has gone up to about 40% of our, contributing to about
36 to be
40%,
exact, but yes,
close to 40% of our oil imports from about 2%. And we've got India abstain several times now on any resolutions that the General Assembly has tried to bring on Gaza because of its relationship, because of our relationship now strategically with Israel.
That's right.
And I've spoken to former ambassadors who say that, the last resolution, even allies of Israel have actually voted against Israel on that one. So help us evaluate what you make of India's national
Well,
interest.
we find it out.
both of these things.
So the last vote of the General Assembly,
Yeah.
India voted for a ceasefire. And there are very few countries now left supporting Israel's continuing this war, and India is no longer amongst them. So that's good. But earlier, you're right. It was strategic calculations. I'm guessing, because no one explained it to me, but I think the feeling was that India felt that that Israel is too indispensable a partner in a number of areas, particularly relating to defense and security issues, and that they felt, therefore, that they have to show Israel the appreciation that an abstention would give them, as opposed to asking them to abandon what they judge to be their strategic interest in continuing the conflict. But now India, like in common with the rest of the world, says enough is enough. This has to stop. And they have now gone ahead and voted in the General Assembly.
And so many countries have said that they will recognize Palestine. India has already done that. But do you...
We were the first
Yes.
country outside the region to recognize Palestine.
Is there a diminishing of India's moral authority, moral position, given that we understand pragmatism and national interest is what drives nations on this front?
Well, there is certainly a change between the sort of moralistic India of the Nehruvian era and the more pragmatic India since then. But did that change only happen now? I mean, one could argue that Indira Gandhi signing the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation in 1971 was a very pragmatic act, especially since it involved an adversary in the Cold War at that time, and then proceeding later to ignore it when it had served its purpose in the 71 war with Pakistan. Those are very pragmatic and very sort of almost realpolitik kind of actions.
Yeah.
So it's not that India has been always moralistic or moral even in its foreign policy actions and choices. We will always put national interest first, but every country does that, Anuradha. Even those countries that profess to have a moral foreign policy will use morality as a fig leaf to justify their naked ambitions. And you've seen this, frankly, with, for example, the Brits and their moral foreign policy when they joined the Americans in invading Iraq.
Yeah.
Or the Americans in some of their interventions in Latin America, again under the guise of morality. So I think in all fairness, one has to accept that whenever anyone says moral foreign policy, I think you quickly make sure your wallet's still in place. Because there is a certain level of insincerity involved in all of this vocabulary. Everyone is looking after their national interests. But I think we have now realized that there are some aspects of our national interests that are better served by taking a stand on principle. So rather than use the word moral, I would use the word principle.
Fair enough.
And there is no doubt that the suffering of the people of Gaza has simply crossed all acceptable limits to the human conscience. And that's why I think India voted the way it did last week.
Let's talk about India and Iran.
Yeah.
Because it's not just a matter of principle, but India distanced itself from the SCO statement, which was a lot more harsher on Israel than India's own statements, which were a little more anodyne. War is not good, de-escalate, etc. Question is, it's not just principle there, it's also self-interest and national interest, isn't it? Because Iran is quite pivotal to India's access to that part of that region in the world, isn't it? So how would you evaluate how India's handled that?
I think we're watching Iran as a very complicated relationship because if Iran suddenly moves into a center of gravity dominated by China and involving Pakistan, that would certainly hurt us. But conversely, for example, during the time of the earlier Taliban regime, Iran was actually working and cooperating with us against the Pakistani-supported Taliban regime of the late 90s. And that's a good example where having kept our options open with Iran at a time when the West was demonizing it actually served our purposes. I think it's now an open secret that Iran and India were cooperating in some of the resistance to the Taliban government in the late 90s and the very beginning of the century. So I think we need to have some connections there. At the same time, we do have long sort of civilizational links. We have, of course,
Commercial
the Parsi
interest with the
community
port,
is
yes.
from Iran. There's also the Irani community, which are not Parsis, who are also here. And there's been a lot of back and forth over a few hundred, if not a few thousand years. So we can't just completely write off all of that, because these connections actually do matter. Given all of that, I think India is trying to keep its channels of communication open in all of these divides. But certainly on the Iran-America conflict, we hoped like hell it would finish quickly, and mercifully it did. And we breathed a sigh of relief, because we didn't want to be forced to either support more American bombing, and for that matter, Israeli bombing, nor did we want to support the condemnation by the other countries of what was being done to Iran. So we were in a very awkward position. Our usual excuse is that we only dissociate ourselves from statements that don't condemn the terrorism against us. And the SCO didn't mention terrorism. Indeed, even some of our abstentions of the UN were because the statements that seemed to demand that Israel give a ceasefire didn't also condemn terrorism in the same breath. So we've got this kind of crusade against terrorism in our own interest as well, in all these international platforms.
So you don't think that India has lost any sheen as a nation that believes in principles, if not morality, if we take that out of the context of nations, in these two cases?
We have interests everywhere. Those interests require a certain amount of dexterity in their public articulation as well as in their private evolution. So it means essentially that when we're talking to the Americans about what's going on in Iran, we may not be saying exactly the same thing as we say when we talk to the Iranians about what's going on with America. But that is not duplicity, that is normal international diplomacy. Throughout in our minds, what we are concerned about is how do we make sure that our interests are preserved, and how do we make sure we don't create enemies where we don't need them?
Okay. Let's talk about, you talked about how we had a unipolar world for almost a decade and more. You talked about how it's evolved to a bipolar world, and now we are India wants it to be a multipolar world, or at least is managing foreign policy with that outlook. How much has Donald Trump changed the world further, this new world order? How much has he contributed to it with his unpredictability?
That's precisely his contribution.
And with our most immediate concern, which is the tariffs that he's imposed, 25%.
Well, the tariffs, fortunately, we can still negotiate downwards, I hope. At least there is a trade negotiation going on. The whole idea is that nothing is sealed forever. Yeah. But certainly this was a rude shock for us. And I must say that that it's not the only unsettling thing he said and done. He said things about
the penalty for Russian oil.
That's unsettling for us.
Yeah.
But he's also said, for example, to the Europeans, he had Vance go out and basically say, Ukraine will have to settle the war on Russia's terms, more or less, is what the Americans said. Now he seems to have backed off from that and is again turning hostile to Russia because Russia wouldn't listen to him and sue for peace. But the fact is that there's all this volatility coming out of his pronouncements, often on social media rather than in any sort of normal diplomatic communication. It's all caps on Truth Social. I mean, what do you do?
Yeah. So, Dr. Tharoor, how does India manage him? Because, there is a dissonance.
Can anyone manage him?
But we have to, right? No one can manage him, but we'll have to. And
we have to manage our own reactions to him.
And also perhaps the perceptions of the relationship, because we believe, when you look at the images that we see of Prime Minister Modi with President Trump, and we see all the hyperbolistic description of that relationship of India and America, and then none of the actions that President Trump has made in the last few weeks, and even after Operation Sindoor, so economical both with the truth and facts. How do we interpret what in the Indo-US relationship is at this point? Because as a layperson, I thought he was our best friend and we had it in our bag and he just listened to everything we said. And now he says we're a dead economy. He says, good luck to you and Russia. He wants, between his own personal business interests in Pakistan and Pakistan's relevance to America, which is never going to go down. What happened?
We're going to find out. The truth is, I wish I was as omniscient as these questions imply. No, the truth is, it's really, really a reflection of a mercurial individual issuing statements that may or may not reflect an underlying shift in national strategy and policy. I say may or may not, because the American system is very different from that of most other countries. The individual in the White House has a tremendous latitude to say and do what he likes, but there is a vast system beneath him that works often to the march of a different drummer.
But Elon Musk has fired that entire system, isn't it? That system doesn't exist.
No, but there still is. I mean, for example, I had a meeting with the entire State Department establishment that existed. I can't say the entire because many positions had not yet been confirmed. That's the other thing about the American system. The Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia, who's going to be our principal interlocutor, is somebody of half Indian origin, a man called S. Paul Kapoor. But he hadn't been confirmed then. He hadn't even had his hearings yet. So he couldn't be at the meetings and we couldn't actually include him in the conversation. But the Deputy Secretary of State, all the senior officials assisting him on South Asia, the people dealing with many of the issues we care about were at the table, and they were totally understanding, supportive, and fully sympathetic to every point we made. I mean, literally to the extent that we could have said that we would not have had a better outcome than if we had written their talking points for them. So when you look at that, you feel reassured that the system works. Then you've got the senators and congressmen. I met a whole bunch of them.
You also met Vice President Vance.
I met Vice President Vance. Totally in the same track, very, very much understanding, turned right around and repeated with respect for India his understanding and sympathy for our stands on many things. So the fact that the one man who doesn't perhaps fully understand or value or empathize with us happens to be in the most important position assumes an outsized importance in our minds. But there is a larger foreign policy bureaucracy that's moving in ways that we would like, and we still have to work with them, and we can probably temper the practical consequences of all this rhetoric in the actual evolution of policy. Now, if it turns out that policy itself is shifting, that there is now a real directive to this entire bureaucracy to turn around and do something different, we are yet to find that out. And I think I don't expect that to be the case. But if it is so, we will find out. I mean, the point is, this is an unpredictable environment. It is unusually unpredictable. Trump 1.0 was not so unpredictable, not least because Trump 1.0 seemed to follow the classic template that the US saw its biggest threat as being from the emerging hegemon China, that therefore India was a useful potential counterweight and bulwark. So we have to support India because it's good for us in America. Therefore, let's support India. And therefore, all the optics, the Ab Ki Baar, Modi Sarkar and all that stuff was very much sort of window dressing or icing on a cake which had been baked in the context of a US-Chinese rivalry. Today, we're no longer so sure because Mr. Trump is making warm noises about Xi Jinping, talking about wanting to meet him, talking about a possible tariff deal with China. Now, if all that happens, we may well find ourselves left high and dry, and then there may be a genuine strategic policy set of choices.
So was it a misstep? Have we overestimated the relationship?
I wouldn't say necessarily, because we don't really know how the very efficient and realistic foreign policy bureaucracy on our side, whether they actually swallowed all the PR that the media was regurgitating. Again, we too have a system where the political class and their publicity machinery will say and behave in a certain way, which is not necessarily reflective of the underlying realities. I mean, as you know, our media, in particular, the sort of hysterical right-wing mass media, had us capturing Islamabad, overthrowing Sharif and General Munir, bombarding Karachi. God knows what else was supposed to have happened. The truth is that if we are misled by that into thinking that our foreign policy bureaucracy, our Ministry of External Affairs, our ambassadors are all swallowing the same hype, we'd be fooling ourselves. They know what the reality is of these relationships. And I think that's honestly the way in which we will have to go, because to us, there is no real doubt about the fact that India has faced and will continue to face some serious challenges, which will require cooperation from the US. We cannot write them off. And at the same time, we also have to depend to some degree on viable trade relations with China. Talk to our business community, which does not want us to turn hostile to China when it comes to importing machinery, the things we make in this country often require Chinese machines to make them with.
And for the past
export
6-7
purposes.
months, we seem to be resetting that relationship, isn't it? After 2020 and Galwan, we are seeing visas being issued, Kailash Mansarovar being accessed again to India.
Well, we began a thaw in September, Anuradha, when there was a conscious effort made to try and improve relations with China. But that took a bit of a setback during Sindoor, when the Chinese were so blatantly helping the Pakistanis, including through real-time satellite intelligence on the presence of our planes and troops and missiles and so on. So honestly, it's not quite the same as September, but Mansarovar is a reflection of what had been agreed before Sindoor had happened.
Okay, so it's not as if that relationship is going full steam ahead. It's still going to be tempered as
well. I think we're talking.
our expectations.
We're talking, and we can't afford not to talk to them either.
Dr. Tharoor, I'm being cued to open this up and not hog the conversation. So
Sure.
let me get some questions in. Okay, I can see a hand there. There's a lady in the third row from the back.
Hello, sir. So good to hear your talk, and it was a delight to be present here. My questions to you would be, what do you think of India's chances for a permanent seat in UN Security Council? And when would we see the next, an Indian being the Secretary General for United Nations?
Well, look, as far as the Security Council seat is concerned, everyone feels it would be a very good idea, but we can't get it alone. Other countries will also have to benefit. And there's a huge problem in getting consensus behind a formula. For example, you can't get the 2/3 of the General Assembly required without the 54 African votes, where the Africans insist on 2 permanent seats for them, and so far others haven't agreed to that. Here's one example. There's also a lot of resistance to some of the contenders. The Pakistanis and to some degree the Chinese are not at all keen on India. The Argentinians are not keen on Brazil. The Europeans are not keen on Germany. I mean, you've got all of these issues in the Chinese are not keen on Japan either. So it's not going to happen overnight, because I remember when Boutros Ghali, Secretary General, in 1992 said that he hoped that UN reform of the Security Council would be done and dusted in time for the golden jubilee of the organization. When was that? 1995. Well, the 50th anniversary is gone, the 60th is gone, the 70th is gone, now the 80th is this year. I'm afraid there isn't any likely immediate prospect. And so my own view is that let's focus on other things at the moment. Let's not give up our claims, because those are legitimate claims. But at the moment, there are bigger fish to fry. As far as the Security Council's Secretary General position is concerned, it's expected to be Latin America's turn now. There's an informal understanding that every 10 years, the position will rotate amongst continents. So we had a European in Kurt Waldheim, succeeded by a Latin American in Perez de Cuellar, succeeded by, as it happens, 2 Africans, Boutros Ghali and Kofi Annan, succeeded by an Asian, which is when I ran for it,
and
Ban Ki-moon, succeeded again by a European. Guterres, he will be succeeded by a Latin. The Latin will be succeeded by an African, and 10 years later, it'll be Asia's turn again. By which time, certainly, I won't be around to take much of an interest in that race. So that train has left the station as far as India is concerned.
In the new world order, artificial intelligence is the new world order, as you have said. But stupidity is never a new world order, is never artificial. Your comments on that?
I think you're totally right, sir. I mean, the old joke about artificial intelligence versus natural stupidity, and I would not want to ascribe that quality to any particular head of state. In particular, if you're thinking of one, and it would not be right. But I will say that is something which also seriously works in world affairs. There's a marvelous book about history by Barbara Tuchman called The March of Folly, where the entire book is a selection of incidents in world history in which it was foolish decisions that created cataclysmic consequences. So folly and stupidity can actually drive events in the world, and history proves it.
Scared of India overpowering?
No, I don't think anyone is scared of us, and nor should we make anyone scared of us. We don't have that kind of power. But I think the thing is that I think that everyone pursues their own interests, and though India is a country of some consequence, I think there is a WhatsApp forward going around saying the real problem is the US is scared of us. I don't really think that's right. WhatsApp University, not a good, reliable source, because I don't think we behave in a manner that anyone should be worried. But we are certainly capable of making a difference. And that's something that's a laudable objective.
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Dr. Tharoor, I thank you so much. It's such a privilege to hear you. I'm wondering, when we talk about India's position in the New World Order, I sometimes sort of sense a little bit of hubris in those statements. And, we're the fifth largest country as far as GDP is concerned. Fourth largest country as far as GDP. But we're also the 141st, we're 141 when it comes to per capita income.
That's right.
I was reading up somewhere.
Human Development Index isn't great either.
Right. Global Gender Gap Index, we're 131 out of 148, 79 out of 142 in the Rule of Law Index, 24 out of 33 countries when it comes to the Free Speech Index. And
You're slipping on the Press Freedom Index too, while you're going on through that list.
So my point is that, is there, do you think India's position in this world order would improve if were we to spend a little more time in fixing some of these institutional voids that exist in the country? And is there a way for us to focus on a more inclusive sort of way forward as a country?
Well, the topic was the world order. And in the world order, I'm afraid it's the absolute size, the absolute heft, the absolute capacity that does count. But as Indians ourselves, I know we would much rather be doing better on all those indices than caring about how we do in the rest of the world. We are now in a much more interdependent world, though. And therefore, it is important in this globalized environment that we also displace weight in a useful way, but with a view to enhancing our own development and growth and our improvement in all these indices. I agree with you. I don't like being in any of those positions on any of those indices. I'd like them all to improve. And it's partially our job in this country to try and make them improve our role in everything from human development to gender empowerment to rule of law to press freedom, all of those things where we've been slipping. And that's what our democracy gives us the right to do, and we should be all out there doing it. But at the same time, when you're talking about India's place in the world order, we are the most populous country in the world. We are the third largest economy. We are one of the most powerful militaries. We do have some extremely advanced technology in a number of areas. So we displace some weight, right? Even when you sit around with the rest of South Asia, you could say at one point last year, it was true, it no longer is, I think, where at one point Bangladesh had a better per capita income than we did. But when we sit at a table with the rest of South Asian countries, we displace more weight than the rest of them put together. We account for 70% of the population of South Asia and 80% of the GDP. Of course, the rest of them are conscious of us. So that's what I meant. It's not in any way diminishing the points you make. It is to say that, while that's our internal concern, from the rest of the world, it's the macro picture they see, and that's a very big picture and a formidable picture.
Do we have time for another question?
Yeah, one last. No? All right. Q will decide the
Sorry, but this gives us a great opportunity and a segue to talk about how Dr. Tharoor will be at the Mumbai Lit Fest, which is presented by Godrej from the 7th to the 9th of November. See
That's good to hear.
how seamlessly we put that in, where he will be talking, among other things, his book, the new book on the Constitution, and many, many other things. So please mark that in your calendar. And also from a Literature Live perspective, we've got the Independence Lecture, the Anil Dharkar Independence Lecture, which will happen on the 26th of August at the NCPA, once again presented very gratefully by Godrej. And it allows us to then talk more about where India is going. And this will be delivered by Santosh Desai. So I think a lot of Inakshi's questions might be covered in that conversation again. One final bit of business, I would like to invite Akshay Chonkar from the Trident Group to just give the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Trident Nariman Point, Mumbai, it is my great privilege and honor to extend our heartfelt thanks and gratitude to Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence tonight, for your inspiring words and ideas, and as usual, enthralling us with your words, as you if I may add, so effortlessly and elegantly do. A big thank you to all our partners and all our guests. It's always wonderful to have you here. Thank you for being part of this. Thank you for being part of the dialogue and the conversations. I wish you all a wonderful weekend with hopefully a very nice result from the match as well, and look forward to welcoming you back soon. Dr. Tharoor, once again, thank you so much. It's been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Jaiswal is out.